So what is CSS? What is it and what do we use it for? We're going to talk about that just next. So when you think about CSS and you think about, HTML adds structure and content to a website, well, essentially CSS adds style, and CSS stands for cascading style sheets. It adds the color and different fonts and a lot of movement and different things you can do, borders with CSS. So CSS really begins to make a website pop. You wouldn't want to have a flower. What if you had every flower that looked exactly the same? That would be kind of boring in life, in the world. You want to have something different, and you wouldn't want to have a website that looks exactly the same, just like somebody else's. You want to do something a little bit different with your website. So that's where CSS really allows you to customize a website. Even though you're going to have content, text, and images and things like that may be the same and look similar to someone else's website, you can make it look really different and make it your own by adding your own colors and fonts and a lot that you can do with CSS. So that's where the style comes in, and this is why we study it and why we use it. So when you think about CSS and you think about things you can do with anything that you have in HTML, any of the content, you can add borders, you can add shading to the boxes that you create in HTML, the elements that you create, colors. You can even add movements and animations with CSS. There's a lot that you can do to make it your own. There's a specific type of syntax that allows you to target a particular element that you have in HTML and add a color to it or a background or shading or a number of different things you do. But you're going to be targeting the element in HTML with a specific syntax for CSS in order to add those styles and add that content, those different colorings and things to it. And then also, as you know, the HTML is going to do your structure, CSS will do your styles, right? So when you think about it, as you're targeting and using that syntax to target a particular element, what are you going to do with the element? What kind of things can you do with the element? Well, there are borders you can add. There's colors. Let's take, for instance, here, this is content, and it's like a box. And almost anything that you do and create in HTML is going to be a box. And when you think about a box, you can do a lot with that box. You can have padding, if you will. Your content could be right here in the center. That could be a picture, or it could be a word. It could be anything. And you can have content here. You can have padding between that content and a border. If you want there to be a border, you can make that border any color. You can make it a different shape if you want to. There's all kinds of things you can do with the content, the padding, the border, shading you can add. There's a bunch of different things like that that you can do with CSS that really makes it come alive. Not only that, you have fonts. You can have different types of fonts and make your website feel differently. Let's say you have a website for cartoons or a website for business. You're going to use different fonts to really bring that across to the audience that's looking at your website. So you almost think of it like it's a paintbrush. You can kind of paint and do what you want to do with it and make the fonts and the styles look very different based on what you want that website to do. And that's essentially what CSS does. So when you go to a website, any website, when you see the coloring that's added, if you see some movement, like usually that movement, a lot of times that movement is done with CSS. Like when I hover over these boxes and I hover over this content for these courses, you can see it's popping up and you can see the color changes a little bit on the background, to let you know that you're hovering over it. You also see that the links are a different color. So they're styled differently and the font a little bit differently. All that you do with CSS, you can do with CSS. So it allows you to add like movement and colors and even a little rounded border, different shapes you can add with CSS to make your website come alive. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Just some things what CSS does for you and the difference between CSS and HTML. And this is why we study CSS, and this is why we have courses looking at both CSS and HTML together, so you can go ahead and do more with your website and website development. And it's also why we've kind of separated those courses so you can really dig into the content of CSS and the content of HTML somewhat separately, because they're both very important to developing a website.